And he's basically saying, look, let's just focus on essential doctrines because people are going to hell, because there's people starving. We don't have time to worry about just, little side issues like real presence in his estimation.
Right.
For him, he says it's the deity of Christ, resurrection, atonement. Those are essential issues.
Hmm.
And what does he base that on? Well, he bases that on the claim that, well, these are found in Scripture.
Right.
And I thought that was ironic because in your discussion with them, you conveniently pointed out that your understanding of real presence is rooted in Scripture, First
Right.
Corinthians 11. And then
Right.
in the post debate discussion you had with me, you discussed John 6. And so there's a biblical basis for the real presence view. And you pointed that out to them in the discussion. So at that point, you have to kind of ask, okay, well, if people are appealing to these things in Scripture, whether it's the resurrection, deity of Christ, atonement, or real presence, how do you then know what interpretation is correct, which was
Right.
back to what you were bringing up originally, and then what parts of Scripture are more essential than others? Kind
Right.
of the example I gave was, I doubt anybody would argue that one's eschatological understanding of Gog and Magog is on the same level as the resurrection or the
Right.
divinity of Jesus or something, right? They're both referenced in the Bible and the canonical scriptures, but I don't think that people would put them in the same category,
Right.
right?
Right.
So how does he automatically assume that real presence is downgraded and divinity and resurrection and atonement are way up there?
Right.
That's my question. That's what came to mind for me. What do you think?
Yeah, that's, I think, the biggest mistake in everything, right? Is he's completely missing the point, right? The whole idea that I was trying to present to him is you have the text, you have Scripture, you can have an infinite number of meanings extrapolated from that text. I
Yeah,
mean, let's talk, for instance, about the deity of Christ. I think, I don't know if I mentioned this last time, but look, when Athanasius and Arius were debating about the deity of Christ, they were both appealing and referencing to Scripture,
right.
right? Same thing goes with atonement. Like in all of the heretical sects that have ever arisen, would appeal to Scripture about atonement.
Mhm.
Even with the resurrection, I know there's even modern day, biblical scholars that, based on their analysis of the text, believe that it was a spiritual resurrection, not a physical resurrection. They're appealing to the text. So does that mean that they believe in the Bible? So it's not an issue of what's in the Bible or not, because
Mm.
anyone can argue that their opinion is present in the text. It's about, does your interpretation line up with the historical interpretation of the text as seen by those who directly receive the text, right? Um, so there's that. And then on top of that, there's also the second question is, who determines what's an important issue and not, right?
Yeah.
Uh, he repeatedly used this word boundaries, which was very funny to me, because you see in a lot of the councils, the early councils of the church, that when they define a dogma, they use this word in the Greek horos, which basically translates to boundaries, that they define and set the boundaries of the faith. And if you step outside that boundary, you've left the church, right? You've made yourself liable to excommunication, meaning you're severed from the communion of the saints, the communion of the church. So in the early church, the people that set up the boundaries were the councils, the consensus of those successors of the apostles. But now what we're seeing is Cliffe is the one making up those boundaries by himself, right? Uh, so this is him. Again, this is a critique that we've seen pretty much every apostolic Christian make to Protestantism, is that in Protestantism, every man becomes his own pope, right? Every person becomes his own infallible interpreter. So you're completely denying any form of a centralized authority, be it for whether it's the magisterium and the Roman Catholic understanding, or for us, it's the local ecumenical councils, right? All of that gets thrown out, and now you have one person and their own personal opinion. That becomes then the final and the highest standard. And so that becomes very problematic. Um, I think one of the things he talked about with the deity of Christ, he said, you must accept that Jesus Christ is God in human form. Okay. Apollinaris would agree with that.
Right.
Apollinaris believes that God is in human form.
Right.
He also believes that Jesus doesn't have a human intellect or a human,
Right.
rationality. So does that mean that he meets the criteria, Cliff? Like, we have to kind of unpack that. Well, are there implications then if I can say God is in human form but he lacks a human soul? Certainly, Saint Gregory Nazianzus and many of the other great saints of that time had an issue with that. They saw there was huge ramifications for believing that. So this kind of blurry and ambiguous reading of what is necessary and what is not necessary it's just never going to work. It's not going to work, especially if you've done even just a basic reading of church history and theology. You know that's not going to cut it. Not to mention, I know I've been rambling, so feel
No,
free to
you're
come
good.
back.
No, keep going.
Not to mention, specifically with the real presence, right? When you're dismissing it, why is he dismissing it? He's dismissing it based on his own presupposition of what salvation is, right? If you believe in the typical evangelical understanding of salvation being this transactional thing that happens in a moment, where the merits of Christ are, as I talked about, direct deposited, and then it's one time you snap your fingers and you're good to go, then of course, basically everything becomes irrelevant. Why is baptism relevant? Why is the Eucharist relevant? But if you understand salvation as the union with Christ, union with God, a transformation into the likeness of God, participating in the divine nature, participating in divine glory, then you'd say, well, no, the fact that I can partake of the actual body and blood of Christ, I can partake in the physicality of God, the Word. Well, no, that actually becomes pretty much the whole basis of the gospel, right? Everything that God, the Word incarnate, did for me is able to become a reality for me in the Eucharist. So now it becomes intimately and inextricably linked to the idea of the gospel. So from a Cliffe's perspective, right, his presuppositions that are already ingrained in him, yeah, it's irrelevant. But again, the question that we're going to ask him is, where did you get those presuppositions? And you can't just say the Bible, because again, the Bible can be interpreted in many ways. The question we have to ask is, was there anyone in the time of the apostles, their direct successors and disciples, and anyone after them in the first, second, third century, and so on in the church that agreed with you? And the answer is no one did.
Hey, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the content. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button, the like button, and if you want to support the channel, visit patreon.com/Reason and Theology.